on Tuesday next week, third hour, we shall look at pre-Viking Ireland. We shall do a similar political and religious survey primarily of the island of Ireland prior to, doors open, prior to the arrival of the Vikings. So we're looking at the period up until the late 8th century. Can anyone remind us briefly anything about the Irish, who they were, what language they spoke, how they were related to Romans, yes or no? Preferably without checking your notes, but we won't say no to them.
I remember the latest Northern Ireland issue.
To be sure, but we're not talking about that now, no. They're Celtic people, so therefore related to the Britons of Britain, but they speak what we sometimes call Q-Celtic, Gaelic, which, as we discussed in the last class, some of them from the northern part of Ireland took this language, and themselves of course, in the kind of late or sub-Roman period probably, and settled in the Western Isles of Scotland and formed the basis of what becomes the Kingdom of Scotland. But today, next week, we'll look at the people who stayed behind, which is obviously the majority. Okay, so Q-Celtic, Celtic people speaking Q-Celtic language. What about Roman, non-Roman, Christian, non-Christian? Yes, they were not part of the Roman world directly. We said weeks ago, Agricola, we think, may have considered some kind of a campaign in Ireland, but it didn't come to anything. So Ireland remained entirely outside the direct influence of the Roman world, though obviously indirectly it will have had many influences from Britain and elsewhere during the Roman and post-Roman period. But as a result, there was no attempt to spread Roman culture, in which we will include Christianity, directly to Ireland. So when we move into the Middle Ages, when we reach the period of the, say, 5th and 6th century, Ireland is technically becoming Christian during that time, and we'll discuss that process later on. Roman culture being not implanted into Ireland, the early Irish perhaps sometimes regarded as continuing an Iron Age form of culture and society which had existed in other parts of Western Europe before the coming of the Romans. This is a great simplification, but we can talk about that. And one of the problems with studying early medieval Ireland in particular is that for a long time scholars saw that somehow the Ireland and the Irish in the early Middle Ages were different from the other Christian people, because by this point, the point I'm talking about, they've become Christian. But for the later period, they were somehow different from the other Christian peoples of Britain or of Western Europe. They were somehow very different. And the writings they've left us seem to support or illustrate that point. So, for example, we have a series of legends and stories, sagas, to use the Icelandic word, of which perhaps the most famous one is this one here, which is the Tyne Bow. What's the iron on? The Tyne Bow Culnia, which means the cattle raid of Cooley, which Culnia Cooley is here. And it tells the story of the sort of prehistoric pagan peoples of what was then a larger version of Ulster and Connacht in a series of conflicts with each other over a cow, primarily over a stolen cow. And the main hero, a kind of Superman figure in fact, is a guy called Cú Chulainn, who has extra powerful strength and defends the Ulstermen and so on. And these and other similar stories are set in the pre-Christian earlier time, though they were probably written down, of course, and even composed later. And they seem to present this Iron Age culture. And for example, one scholar, Kenneth Jackson, wrote a book called A Window on the Iron Age. He said that we could look back at the lost Iron Age by reading these and other stories and so on. And again, therefore, showing that Ireland was somehow trapped in the Iron Age and different and somehow pagan and separate, and its writings were different from what was going on in the rest of early medieval Christian Europe. And then over the past few decades, scholars have more and more argued against this approach and have said that they're just reflecting their Christianity and their ideas and their political ideas in another way, but we shouldn't see Ireland as somehow different and pagan, or somehow different in its form of Christianity and its culture and so on. It's part of the ongoing culture of Western Europe during that period, and it reflects it perhaps in slightly different ways and so forth. The sources, I'll say a little bit about how we can study early medieval Ireland. Now again, as we saw with Britain, if we're looking at the 5th and even into the 6th century, we have documents which seem to refer to this period and tell us about the kings and the rulers from this time. But these are dating from the 8th and the 10th and later century, so they're referring back to this earlier period and earlier as well, things like this, obviously. But to what extent these later sources can tell us what was going on in this dark period is, again, something of debate. In the old days, people would take the Irish annals, the chronological year-by-year accounts of events, or the Irish genealogies, which is one of the things I've worked on a lot when I used to do historical research, and they would say, oh, these are great detailed sources, they can tell us all about the 5th century history of Ireland and so on. And these days, we're saying, no, you can't reach that far back. They're legends, they're reconstructed, the similar things that we were talking about with the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and so on. So if you pick up a book about medieval Ireland or early medieval Ireland written recently, it will be very kind of brief and uncertain about this period. But if you pick up a book that was written about Irish history 50 years or earlier, it might give you a very detailed account of the great 5th and 6th century kings and so on. So again, we have to be careful. But we do have, compared to for England, for example, we do have quite a lot of detailed sources. It's just how we can use them that's important. So I mentioned, for example, for Ireland, we have a lot of annals. These are year-by-year accounts of events, and sometimes we have quite a lot of events set out. We also have detailed genealogies telling how the different kings and their families were related and where they come from and so on. And these are, they can be put together. So it tells you who the guy's relatives were, and here it tells you what he did when he was alive, or at least when he was killed and things like that. And you can, in theory, even for this period, but we don't want to do it anymore, we can reconstruct a kind of political narrative in a lot of detail. In addition, medieval Ireland has left us a lot of laws, a lot of law codes from the very early period, dating with the 8th and 7th centuries again as well, perhaps reflecting earlier and preserving earlier laws. So we can say quite a lot about early Irish society, the structures and organised nature of the society, and I think Fatty's going to perhaps mention some aspects of this in his talk. Again, we have to be a little bit careful. A lot of these Irish laws, when they're talking about social divisions, are very, very clear. They have very distinct categories, and certain people do this and certain other people do this and so on. And probably society was more flexible. It was not so black and white in the distinctions and divisions it made. This is what the lawyers who've created these law codes would like to present, this ideal picture. But again, it's one way of reaching back into their society. We also have, for elsewhere, but also for Ireland quite a lot, for the early period, of what is known as hagiography. What's that? Hagiography. Anyone know what hagiography is?
The likes of things that
Saints, yeah. You think of Hagia Sophia, Istanbul, okay, Saint Sophie or whatever, holy. Hagios means saint or holy and so on. So it's the writings about saints. And these are accounts often written perhaps in the 11th and 12th century, some of them a bit earlier, the ones that relate to people like St. Patrick, but written again later on, but writing about the period allegedly of the 5th, 6th and 7th century and what the early saints did, how they set up their churches and which saint was more powerful than another saint and things like that. And these again look very nice and detailed. They give very nice stories and narratives, including miracles, miraculous things that the saints did, copying, of course, the kind of things that Jesus is said to have done in the Bible. And again, they're very unreliable, not only because we don't believe in miracles anymore necessarily, but also because, from a political perspective, they're pushing back the view of 9th or 12th century religious politics and trying to put it into the earlier period, for example, to explain the relationship between different saints and things like that. So again, we may or may not be able to use these. Most people will be very wary of using these kind of things for writing a kind of solid narrative of events and so on. And just to remind us, one of the few really contemporary sources that we have, let's see if it will come up on this guy for the moment so we can have multimedia, are the inscriptions on stones. We saw one example from Wales. What's this kind of stuff called? Anyone remember? Ogham or Ohm, okay? Sometimes spelt with the H or not, depending on which Irish orthography you want. Cutting these lines into the edges on rocks and so on. Picture's not so clear. Maybe if I switch this thing off. It's not even very clear there. But plenty of these surviving from the southern and western parts of Ireland and elsewhere we saw on the map before. Usually giving the names of people. We presume someone who's perhaps died or something like that. Okay, and usually a kind of surname or family name, so Erk, okay, and then Mak, Maki, Erkias, Mu, what we got here? Something in the way, what's in the way? What's this thing in the way? Mu Dovinia, okay, and these can tell us about people, but also these parts tell us about families or tribal groups, perhaps in the late Roman or pre-Christian period as well. So we can get some picture from these of the ways that politics and society was organized, but they only give us a very kind of superficial view, okay, and trying to combine them with the rest of the stuff is often quite difficult. Okay, so what we're going to be doing in this topic is looking at how we can use these sometimes difficult sources to understand early Ireland, pre-Viking Ireland. We'll talk a bit about the politics, and I'll return to this map in the second hour today. And beginning today, perhaps, or in more detail on Tuesday next week, we'll look at the development of Christianity, the arrival and spread of Christianity amongst the Irish. The Irish are still today a very religious people, of course, and in the Middle Ages, they were a very, very important Christian group. They left Ireland once they became Christian. They spread Christianity to other parts of Europe, as well as being active through Scotland and so on in Britain as well, but also in Gaul and France and things like that, and Germany. So the arrival of Christianity in Ireland, a very important event in that sense, although it wasn't a single event, an important series of events for European history, not just for Ireland. Okay, what I'll do now is talk about the main political divisions in early medieval Ireland, with special reference to what we call the pre-Viking period and the early stages of that, in a sense. Fatih said a little bit about this in his presentation, and I shall go over vaguely some of the ground, but I shall go into more detail. So there'll be quite a lot of names of dynasties or kingdoms, depending on how we look at it, or peoples and so on. And I'll try and write up as much as I can. And obviously, please say, can you say that again, or spell that again, or something like that if it's not clear. As Fatih said, for most people, politically speaking, in early Ireland, the fundamental unit was probably what we know as the tuath, which is translated in various ways, but sometimes as just people, okay, the people, or even as tribe or something like that, okay. And as he said, in the laws at least, in the rather more schematic way that society is presented in the laws, each tuath was said to have a king, Shi, okay, who was obviously a very petty, small, minor figure. And to a large extent, the kings of the tuaths do not appear in the main political narratives, in the genealogies and the annals. Okay, it's the people higher up the political hierarchy that concern us. So perhaps the way to begin would be to begin the other way around and to start from the top and kind of work our way in to the lower levels. Okay, now essentially, Ireland politically, not too dissimilar to what we saw, for example, in England, but in this period and beyond, into the Viking period as well and beyond, Ireland was very hierarchical in terms of the way politics was organised. The main big unit, we use the English word province, sometimes used to render the Irish word coicad, which literally means a fifth, okay? Because in the earlier period, in the kind of pre-Christian period, it is believed that Ireland was made up of 5 provinces. So there were 5 of these, each one covering a fifth. And these, there are various definitions of these, but one of the standard ones is Connacht, it's Connachta in Old Irish, Connacht today, Leinster, Leighin, Munster, or Muvu, Ulster or Ullath, and Meath, Mither. Okay, and most of these names you'll see have this element here. One theory is to get, for example, we have Tir is a Celtic word for land. This is the English S, okay, added later on though when the English have arrived. So the Ulleth's Tir gets kind of squashed up and becomes Ulster. Moo's Tir, land, becomes Munster and so on. So apart from Connacht, which has a different structure, and Meath, these 3 are, this is one possible explanation or etymology for the English form. Okay, but we can use either, it's not so important. Connachta is this area in the west. Munster, Muvu, is this area in the southwest. Leinster, originally extending up to somewhere here, okay, covering the eastern, southeastern part. Ulster, look at the stretch up, is up here and originally kind of round here as well. And Meath, which is the more debatable area, is somewhere around here. This is Western Meath. Meath are still names of these areas here, okay, bordering with Leinster. So these were the provinces, okay. Later on, that pattern, this idealized 5th pattern, gets kind of altered during the 5th and 6th centuries, the kind of dark period that we're not sure exactly what happened. But at the end of that dark period, for practical purposes, there are more provinces, or more, perhaps what we should now call over kingdoms. Okay. And that's what I've added on here. It all latches on these people called the Ui Nail, which means the grandsons or descendants of Neil. That's how you should spell Neil correctly in the Old Irish way. And the Neil in question is this legendary guy called Neil Noigillach, which is Neil of the 9 hostages. Okay, that's his nickname. And he is the ancestor of a new family who probably were connected somehow with Connacht, okay, which is what's going on here. The Connacht claim to be descended from Con, and these are the Connachter, and he was meant to be brother, but by a different mother, of the ancestors of the Connachter. Now that may not be true, but it indicates some kind of connection, some origin in these kind of area here of Connacht, okay? And people who later on, dynasties, families, kings who claim to be descended from Neil of the Nine Hostages, okay, began 5th or 6th centuries, talking about the 6th century perhaps, to push out of Connacht both northwards into Ulster, this way, and then eastwards into what becomes the southern Enale, the Meath region, okay? So they get land and take it away from the Ullad in the north, and they get land and take it away primarily from the northern part of Leinster as well, and set up these two new over-kingdoms. The northern Enale, because they're in the north, and the southern Enale, because they're further south than their cousins in the north. And somehow connected to these people were the Argila, who I've put in brackets here, because they seem to form a separate over-kingdom, but sometimes under the control of the Enale, okay, sometimes under the Enale control. And that's kind of this area here, which again takes land away from the men of Ulster. And it's supposed to be the ancestors of the Argila, who are here, three guys called Collar, who are supposed to have destroyed the old fortress Evan Wacha of Ulster. And that's the point when Ulster is more or less kind of squeezed in. Okay, so the Enale, and they're somehow connected, perhaps under kings, the Argila, responsible for adding a new element, particularly in the north of Ireland and the middle of Ireland, and reducing partly Leinster, but primarily Ulster. Ulster was the big loser in this kind of process. So by the period when we come to the 7th and 8th centuries, when we can begin to rely upon our sources and write kind of something that looks like a political narrative, we have something like this. And my lines I've drawn in blue obviously are kind of flexible boundaries. People didn't have fixed boundaries in quite a modern way. But we have the reduced kingdom of Ulster, the Ullad, up here. We have the northern Enale up here. We have the Argila here. Connacht here. The southern Enale kingdoms here. The slightly reduced Leinster here, and then Munster there. Okay. And I'm going to go sort of through each of these and explain the details. So these over-kingdoms, we can't call these provinces because we wouldn't really call the southern Enale a province, so we'll use over-kingdom now. Okay. These 6 or 7, depending how we look at it, over-kingdoms were the main big entities of early medieval Irish politics. And each of these over-kingdoms was made up of numerous smaller kingdoms, okay? And each of these smaller kingdoms was often made up of even smaller groups below that, okay? We have a hierarchy of kings, perhaps in the way that we see in the laws. But each of these kingdoms, kind of with the exception of Ulster, was made up of kingdoms or dynasties, ruling families, who claimed to be related. And maybe they were not. And that's what we've got here. So, for example, we said about the Connacht guys here, okay? The main families, particularly the Ivrian and the Fiachrach, were the main families ruling early Connacht, and they claimed to be descended from 2 brothers, and they had some other brothers as well, okay? And they traced their ancestry back to Con Ciad Cathach, Con of the 100 Battles, okay? And whether they were related or not is obviously something we can debate. Okay? They wanted to be related because they're sharing power. And it's similar in many of the other kingdoms. Okay? In the northern Enale, we have the Ken Connell and the Ken Niogan, okay, who are these two guys claiming to be sons of Niall of the Nine Hostages. We have a number of other sons, but the important ones for the southern Enale are, well, mainly descendants of Connell here. In fact, slightly different. We have a different ancestor. We mentioned the Ariela, all claiming to be descended from Colla, and so on. So we have lots of separate kingdoms, but we have some families or kingdoms within these provinces that were dominant, and usually they claimed to be related. And each of these separate kingdoms would compete for the over-kingship. So it would be at any one time a man who would call himself King of Leinster, and there would be another man who would be claiming to be King of all of Munster. And these guys would come from one of the families, okay? Sometimes the kingship of the province or the over-kingdom alternated. So we have examples of the alternation in Ulster, for example, between the Dal Fiatach and the Dal Naratha. Okay, the kingship of Ulster alternated between these families, and similar cases for elsewhere. So at the top, in theory, is the provincial or over-kingdom with its own king, who was a member of one of the main families or kingdoms of the province. And then below him and the other main families were lots of smaller kingdoms. If you could claim to be connected to the big guys, if on your genealogy you were important enough that you could claim to be part of the big families, okay, then you were probably doing okay. But in addition to these kind of people, there were also, and they're not so much marked on here, other groups. I know the Corcovaskin over here, for example, Clare and others, who were not connected to the main genealogy of the particular provincial families. They had their own ancestry, often connecting them to some other part of Ireland. And they were a minor people. Often they had to pay higher tribute or something to the provincial king, and their position was lower. Okay. So we have a province or over-kingdom. We have a number of, often quite a lot, sometimes smaller, families or groups who controlled the province, sometimes alternating, and they claimed in most cases to be related to each other, which may or not have been true. And then below them we have less powerful alleged relations of theirs, and then below them we have other groups that were, for one reason or another, unable to connect their genealogy to the big guys, and they were the very minor groups and so on, who never had a chance at having power beyond their own little regions and things like that. Okay, so that's a broad summary of the general patterns. Okay, and now we're going to go through each of the provinces briefly, mentioning the main groups again, and saying a little bit about the characteristics, the main characteristics. So let's start with the Enale. So, and I'll go over some ground again. This bit of the genealogy here, and we're going to refer to the northern Enale and the southern Enale there. As I said, they all claim to be descended from a common ancestor, Niall of the Nine Hostages, who had numerous sons. Okay. Now, obviously, men can acquire lots of sons during their life, but it's more likely that once you have identified a kind of ancestor figure, as we said, people will try and connect their family tree to this person for various reasons, or they will be connected by others to the family trees. So this kind of little picture of a nice happy family of Niall with all his sons, and there are stories about what he said to them when he was dying and these kind of things. This is probably artificial. Okay, this is a political propaganda of people trying to explain their power or explain their attempts at power and connecting up to him. If he existed at all, he probably lived during the 5th century. Okay, there are dates given to him in the annals, but we don't trust these as reliable. And he's one of these guys who's presented as attacking the British coast during the late Roman period and post-Roman period. Okay, one of these Irish pirates that were causing trouble for the British. We'll mention Irish pirates and so on later on. The important thing, as we said, is that he's connected to Con of the 100 Battles, who's the ancestor of the Connaughta. That's why they claim to have their name, the people of Con, the descendants of Con. And there are a number of sons of this guy, Jochad Mormethon, who are the Connaughta, and the Inail at some point connected themselves on, but said with a different mother. So we're a bit different. We're related to the Connaughta, but we're a little bit different. We have a slightly different kind of status and so on. The northern Inail, comprising a number of groups, but most importantly, Kenel Noan and the Kenel Connell, who are coming from, claim to be descended from, again, a guy called Connell and a guy called Ogun. Okay. There were a number of other branches, but they're the two most important ones. And in the long run, it's the Kenel Noan who become more important, and the Kenel Connell cease to have great power, and so on. Okay, and connected to this group, perhaps politically at least, is or were, as I said, the Yargila. Gial here again is word for servant or hostage, things like that. It might be the same hostages that Neil claimed to have. Okay, and they form a semi-independent group who you can also have a king of the Argila, so they formed their own province or over kingdom, we should say, but they owed kind of tribute, amongst other things, to the northern Inail, and so sometimes we include this area together, sometimes we can see this as kind of separate and things like that, and the legends tie them together, and the genealogies artificially tie them together probably as well, but part of the same expansion perhaps coming this way that reduced the power of Ulster and set up a new system, as we explained before. The southern Inail, the southern branch, okay, more or less taking over the old province of Meath, and gaining land at the expense of the Leinster men as well, as I explained. And they have, again, two main groups. They have many different branches descended from these guys, but the two main ruling groups during our period coming from this guy called Dermot MacKirval. Okay, and I'll write that up because you can't see those very well. One set called the Shill Near the Sloan, and then another group called the Clan, the family of Colman Moore, Colman the Great. Okay, and they were from this guy. And the kings of the Shill Near the Sloan were kings of Brega, which is here in the eastern part of the kingdom, and the kings of the clan Colman, sometimes called kings of Usnech, and they were a bit further east. And again, these are the two dominant branches that alternate and vie for power, but after about 730, okay, it's the Clan Colman who take over, and before 730, the Shill neither Slan had more power, or there was more alternating. Now, the kingdom of the southern Inail, or the over-kingdom of the southern Inail, is interesting because also in here, it's not marked on this map, but it might be on this map if I can find it. Yes. As part of this kingdom, and here's the old scheme where we don't have the southern Inail, is this place called Tewar, spelt in modern Anglo-Irish, or whatever you want to English, Tara. Okay, and this was an important pseudo-religious political site, and it's connected to the concept of the High King of Ireland. As Fatty correctly said before, you could not really effectively talk about a King of Ireland, and even that certain people would argue that Brian Boru was not really a true king or whatever. But there was the concept of the Ardrí, which means high king, okay, or the king of Tara. So a king who was inaugurated and saw his power base as being in Tara. And there is a tradition, more like a fiction, similar to the idea of the Bretwalda that I mentioned from Bede for England, that the high kings or kings of Tara were therefore kings or had their power over the whole of Ireland and were the most powerful rulers. And this is very unlikely, okay? It's unlikely, and in the early period, the kings of Tara were members of the Inail, okay, southern and northern Inail, who controlled Tara. It's unlikely that these people in the early period can control what's going on in Munster in a way that a modern king of a nation could do. So this was a kind of fiction, political fiction, set up by the Inail, again, to put themselves forward and things like that. But in the later period, we do get people who may, like Brian Boru, who may have exerted a certain level of power beyond their own province and so on. But it's unlikely that we can really see these early kings of Tara in such a kind of strong light. So this again is political propaganda, and a lot of what we've got, as you're seeing, is the Inail political propaganda. I begin with them because they're the most significant in the long run. Fatty? Yes, you have, again, we're not going to we're going into plenty of detail here, we won't go into that kind of detail, but you get, periodically, you'll get wars, sometimes between small kingdoms that drag in other kingdoms, and sometimes you even had kind of massive battles where the annals will say, on one side were these guys, and it gives you a list of them, and it'll be perhaps the kings of Munster with some of their relations and other people from Munster, and they may have been fighting against perhaps the Southern Inail, and then you get the Southern Inail and their allies mentioned, and perhaps Leinster might be siding with one group or the other, and things like that. So certainly, for practical purposes, Irish kings, whether they were just kings of a kingdom, or high kings, or provincial kings, or even kings of a tuath, would ally with other people for various different reasons and things like that. No, things could fluctuate, okay? I mean, anyone could fight anyone, as far as I can see. You may have certain groups supporting each other. Within a province, of course, usually people were expected to follow the provincial kings. So if the king of Munster, whoever that might be at a certain time, was fighting against the Southern Inail or members of the Southern Inail group, then he would expect other kings from Munster to come and fight on his side. But you do get exceptions to that rule. You do get certain groups fighting against their over-king for various reasons. And you can usually explain alliances according to various practical reasons, but you don't get stable alliances going on and treaties drawn up and things like that. It was these battles and alliances were fluctuating depending on what was going on at the time and what the interests of the kingdom or the king were at that point and so on. Any other questions while we're at this point? Any other things? Okay, so that's the Inail, who I started with, who were the most important group, I think. Then, as I said, I mentioned briefly already the Connachta, who, on the kind of island-wide scale, do not figure so significantly during our period, though kings from Connacht become perhaps more important in the later Middle Ages. But for the earlier period, they're significant as the kind of originators in some way of the Inail. They claim to be descended, as you said, from a eponymous, which means someone whose name is connected, Connachta and Con up there, of the 100 battles, and a number of groups claiming descent from a series of brothers, as I said, Neil connected to those. And these are the two main groups here, the Ivruin and the Ifriachach. The Ifriachach were particularly important in Connacht politics during the pre-Viking period, and then later on, during the later period, we see some groups from the Ivrian becoming the more dominant and being able to become kings of Connacht and so on, and things like that. Again, in this case, we have some kind of degree of alternation, but focusing primarily on these guys. Moving south and eastwards to Leinster. We said before, Leinster originally extending up here and incorporating what becomes Tara, okay, but losing a lot of the northern land to the incoming Inel, politically, or whatever that might be, whatever that means, so that practically this is the region that we would call Legin or Leinster during our period. I have, I think, a diagram for them. Early Kings of Leinster. Quite a complicated chart, but I've marked the main names again that we need to look at in red. Is that coming on here? Make it a bit smaller. The focus will work. Leinster during this period was dominated primarily by this family during the early period called the Dunlana. A number of branches of that family controlling the kingship of Leinster. For a while, the Kenselig in the south also had some power, but they get more power again later on. So the dominant family is the Dunlinga, who includes the Phylan, who are very important, okay, in particular. But we see a number of other families, small groups, who are members of the Leinster supergenealogy, and they're connected up here to a slightly earlier common ancestor, okay, ultimately Cahamar, but for these guys it's later on. So again, quite a complicated tree, mostly small families, okay, the dominant dynasties in the north and in the south controlling the main politics of the area. And finally, well, not finally, penultimately I should say, Munster, the other big region. Munster focusing politically on a capital place called Cashel in Irish, and the dominant groups or dynasties were all called the Yoganacht or Yoganachta, okay, and that's what you can see up here. This is the chart of their family and other connected groups and so on. So here are the main Yoganacht families and some others, and then some different groups that descend from different sons down here, all coming from a guy called Conall Cork. But just to make sure that you understand their name, they claim to be descended from a guy called Mug Nuadat, alias Yogan, alias another kind of Yogan, and then he had a grandson called Yogan. So they're putting the name Yogan, which is where we get the Yoganachta in, kind of overkill, just to make sure they could explain their name. And again, this is a very artificial, unhistorical chart, trying to bring in the Yoganachta, the dominant groups, and then tying in them plus a few other related Munster families to them, and so on. And I've underlined the main families here. You can see they were spread throughout different parts of the kingdom. And the kingship of Munster alternated not between just two of these groups, as we've seen, say, here or here or here, but between a number of them. So at one point, someone from the Oganach Cashel might be king of Munster. Then when he dies, someone from the Oganach Glendavnach might become king. And then when he dies, someone from the Oganach Loch Lane might become king of Munster. And then it might go back to Cashel, then it might go to the Oganach Rathlin, and so on. So there was more alternation between different groups. There was not one or two kind of dominant members until the post-Viking period, when we see one or two of these taking over or dominating more effectively. Traditionally, there's meant to be 7 of the Oganachs, but there were some other groups as well, so that's an artificial number set up. And just before, after the Viking period, I should say, a new family came into power called the Dal Cash, who were not technically related to these guys, but they eventually fit their genealogy onto them, and then they replaced them. And it's of that family that Brian Boru, the guy that we saw in Fatty's presentation, he was a member of the Dal Cash. So they come along, establish their power, probably coming from somewhere up here, possibly connected to this family, and then they spread their power over, and then they come to replace the Oganach as the kings of Munster, but that's in the 10th and 11th centuries that we see that happening. Okay, let's go. Yes, you've got to go. I think that might be locked. Right, you'll have to sneak across, but we can always edit this bit out. You can come through the front because Emre can edit it out. We've almost finished, in fact. I'm going to finish a bit early today, I think. Okay. And then lastly, in the northeast of Ireland, we have what was left of the old province of Ulster. And here we have a number of families or dynasties that were in fact kingdoms that were in fact not related to each other. Right up in the north we have the Dalriata, who are not very important, except they possibly from there some of the immigrants went to Scotland, which is why we have the kingdom of Dalriada in Scotland. But it's these groups that were more important in the early Middle Ages, the Dal Naratha and the Dal Fiatach, with to some extent the Echach Cobo, who were related to these, but these were not. So these are kind of claimed to be connected and these ones don't. They're the ones who alternate in political power. In the long run, it's the Dal Fiatach who gain greater power in Ulster, though Ulster remaining quite a small and less powerful region, so not so important in the kind of big politics of Ireland during the pre-Viking period. Sorry? Armagh, somewhere around here. We'll talk about Armagh, or we could talk about it now, but I think we'll postpone the religious stuff until Tuesday because I don't want to kind of cut that discussion up. Okay. Right, so that's the brief survey of the politics. As you can see, therefore, we've got these provincial kingdoms made up of a number of dominant groups who are just the most powerful ones. They've got more sword power or whatever it is, okay, and they can assert their position more. They claim to be related, and maybe some of them were related, some of them possibly not, but to prove their power, they often connected their genealogies. And then below these we have a series of less powerful kingdoms, some of them perhaps very old families, which have now been replaced. It's thought, for example, that perhaps the Corcoloidja, I think down here, may have been very important groups in Munster once, but the Oganach came and replaced them. That's one example of that kind of thing. So quite a complicated hierarchy and kind of patchwork of kingdoms, over the top of which we have this provincial pattern. And as I said, and as Fatty said in his presentation before, the concept of the High King, the King of Tara, as a king of the whole of Ireland, was, for the most of the earlier period, a fiction. Okay, it was not something that had a real strong politics. You can't claim that one of the kings of high kings of Ireland, or someone who claimed from here, from the Inail, actually ruled the whole of Ireland. That wasn't the case. So we can move up from little kingdoms to the provincial level, to the over kingdom level, but we can't go beyond that, I think. And when you come on to religious history, you will find a similar kind of very complicated pattern of monasteries and churches, which were not independent from the secular politics, and we'll talk about those on Tuesday. Okay, any final questions or thoughts? Okay, let's finish there then. Remember, for Tuesday, you need to read your internet copies of the Cain Adamnan, which is a religious law code from early Ireland. And we can put that both into the context of law, but also into the context of religious history as well.